Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China's top leadership has laid out its economic priorities for the coming year, with emphasis on expanding domestic consumption while curbing the growing risks of monopolistic practices. So what are the major tasks and what are the impacts? How are the lingering effects of COVID-19 and the rise of anti-globalization sentiment affecting China's domestic reforms? To talk about these issues and more, I'm joined by Liu Zhiqin, Senior Fellow of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University, Dr. William Li, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute, and Steve King, crowd-founded Professor of Economics on Peitrom. And that's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, Mr. Liu. Well, the Central Economic Work Conference has taken note of the economic recovery amid COVID-19, and it has set out a series of policies guiding China's economy in 2021. But what do you think will be the economic priorities for China?
I believe that there are so many important points to be discussed during this conference. But the priorities that to be done in the next year's economic development should be focused on two sections. The one section is, as I said, always that stabilizing the achievement and what we have done in the past years, especially the recovery of economy and also the achievements that to conquer the pandemic outbreak in China. And then the second step is to improving the present situation for better conditions to develop further next year. And the third, of course, the third step is also to upgrading our economic status, that to finish all these goals that we have outlined for the year to come. Of course, people always say that we have two priorities at the moment. First is to improve the domestic demand side reform. And the secondly, also the risk management, the risk control, and the prevention, especially for financing sectors. So all these 2 points will be the focusing and the key element for the year to come. So the whole party and the government and administration is now working hard for detailed program and the plan how to fulfill all these tasks and jobs for the next year.
All right, and Steve, do you think stability and growth, those are the two things that Chinese decision makers should take notice, and are they striking the right note?
Yes, I think so. It must be done as first priority. As we know that from the situation compared to outside the international market, all other countries, they are still fighting and struggling in a hard time against the pandemic outbreak in many countries, especially for those advanced countries there. So China is also facing great challenge how to deal with the further infections in this field. So how to stabilize the achievements, what we have got during this pandemic struggling. So this is very important, because without the safety, without the safeguard of this pandemic battle, we should not and we could not continue our other business and other efforts. So in this way, stabilizing is the first step and the priority for whole nation. And then we can improve all these conditions, what we have done, to get a better environment, especially for business environment, not only for domestic but also for outside. So especially for domestic demand, how to upgrade it. So we are going to get the further so-called quality growth. How to do it, how to get it. I think the three steps must be done in this way that we can get near to the purpose.
And William Li, China is probably the only major economy that can achieve positive growth, but still, the Chinese policymakers still worry about fragility of the recovery. Do they have the right reasons, William?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the emphasis on the dual circulation strategy shows that China's concerns about domestic demand being strong enough to sustain the recovery globally and to help being a locomotive for growth for the rest of the world is really spot on. I think one thing I would add to the discussion so far is China really has to focus on its domestic household service sector development, and going forward, getting the financial markets within China. The main job there is to get the money to the people who need the money and take away money to the people who are not using the money productively. And that challenge is something that's going to come with structural reforms in the regulatory system of the financial markets. Because the one thing China wants to avoid would be to have problems in excess amount of debt, to have problems with bankruptcy, to disrupt the ongoing recovery. And the structural reforms that are needed to do that, I think, have been well advertised by the leadership in China, which include hukou reform, allowing the migrant workers to establish themselves as urban dwellers and to be able to buy land and buy property, to contain the rise in the property market so that it's a stable source of wealth and something not a speculative flurry, and also for households to be assured that as they get older, they will have a sufficient income to be able to sustain their consumption. And the worry about demographics in China comes back to haunt us because the size of the working age population is starting to shrink now, and the key impetus for China will be to emphasize productivity growth so that we can make up for the drop in the working age workforce that will be able to sustain the kind of growth that China needs to be able to carry forward with an aging and retiring population.
And as you said, domestic consumption has been named one of the major tasks at the leadership meeting. Probably one of the reasons is that there are disruptive changes of outward demand. So it's suggested that China will promote employment, improve social security, optimize income distribution structure, and expand the middle income group. William, are these measures working in sync? How can they pan out?
Well, these are terrific challenges, not just for China, but for the rest of the world, because the structure of demand, especially household demand, is shifting very rapidly. The pandemic has accelerated the ongoing trend toward e-commerce and e-payment systems. The pandemic has also accelerated the way in which production is done, especially in the service sector. Production no longer seems to be requiring the kind of proximity and urbanization and centralization that was assumed to be needed in the past. Citibank, my former employer, has just told its employees you can work remotely for quite a while, and the need to travel to see clients has been minimized, as this demonstrates. So here I am in Washington, and we're having a global discussion on your show. These technological changes are shifting the composition of service sector demand. And the challenge for the leadership in China is that so far domestic demand has been boosted very successfully by public consumption and infrastructure spending. What we have to see going forward is a very nuanced shift from public consumption to private household consumption. And in order to do that, the households have to be reassured, as I said earlier, that their income growth will be sufficient going forward and employment growth will be sufficiently stable that they will be able to unleash the amount of consumption rather than saving all of their income.
And Mr. Liu, what the government needs to be doing to boost household consumption?
I believe that the household consumption is one major part in China because we have so huge a population, 1.4 billion people there, and all the families that they need the household expenditures, and also they like to travel, they like to gather together, catering services, and also for other purposes, for instance, education and health care. So all these expenditures are becoming a major part of the GDP of the nation, the development. So this is very important for our nation, for the government to pay more attention, to give more favorable policies to support, to stimulate all this expenditure. But I have to say something else, that but the household expenditure cannot be sustainable. So because all these house or family, they have some limitation. They have the saturate. That means by some time that they have got enough things on enough consumption. They have to wait for new products or new supply chains reform. So in this way that there is a time gap between the first consumption to the second wave of consumption. Especially for those young people, they are coming for more luxurious consumption, especially for also their life stream, and for instance, also for makeup and also for beauty services and different salons also. So in this way, expenditures can be diversified in different ways. But if the quality is upgraded, I mean that the price and also quality of service will be improved, and the people can pay more for such expenditures. So in this way, the household consumption cannot be sustainable if the supply chain cannot follow up. So, of course, I have to say one thing, the point, that not only the household expenditure, but the public expenditure should be also one important part of this whole program.
And there is also a very prevalent argument that is the Chinese household are not spending enough because they have worries on health care, on insurance, on pensions, and housing. Can the government afford to subsidize them so that they have less worries to spend? Mr. Liu?
Yes, this is a hard discussion. As we know that some authorities, especially in charge of the life insurance and also healthcare insurance, they're also discussing with the public how to deal with the situation and the new challenges. Of course, the people, they have the good reason to worry about the aging time. So now young people is very exploded to expenditure for different things and items. So they don't care about the 10 or 20 years a bit later. But the parents, the elderly people, they are a little bit worried about the future because of the high rising price of the products and also household. So they have to pay more attention, more reserve for so-called this healthcare, and for also not only healthcare but also for some unexpected issues. For instance, accident and illness and something like the pandemic outbreak. So in this way, many people have to be prepared to get ready to deal with all these unexpected difficult times. So I think this is also our culture. Always teach us that we should be prepared, should be ready for everything.
Let's move on to another priority, William. That is China's plan to strengthen its technological innovation and building more independent and controllable supply chains. So the global supply chain has been under a lot of stress this year because of COVID and also because of onshoring of manufacturing in many developed nations. William, do you think China's blueprint for technological independence is the right thing to do?
Well, I think the goal should be not so much technological independence, but rather I think President Xi has emphasized that he wants China to be at the frontier of technological change, for China to adopt a leadership role in pushing the frontier forward and not just relying on the Western designers to be able to do that. And I agree. I think the world would benefit.
Because China can be cut off from the supply chain if those advanced economies decided not to supply the most advanced technology.
Well, I take issue with that because I think one of the issues about the global supply chain that we're facing on a political level is that it has reassurances of where the supply goes when it's exported to China and how it's being used. And that's, I think, a technical issue of achieving sufficient transparency and accountability for where these items go. But I think China's progress has already been established in certain areas of artificial intelligence and facial recognition and a lot of technologies that are very useful for the rest of the world. The key is for China to be able to develop these technologies in a way that the world can use these technologies. The world develops in many different ways, and China's technologies have to plug into and be part of the global network. We saw examples in the past where failures to do that are tragic. Look at what happened to Japan when it developed the Betamax format for recording. It was technologically absolutely the best around, but the world market didn't adopt it because it didn't have sufficient capacity. And recognizing demand not just within its domestic market to be a monopolist supplier there and to tell people this is what you need, but rather to be sensitive to where the market is driving things.
Yeah.
That is really the crucial challenge for China and all technologies going forward.
Mr. Liu, do you think China can make both happen at the frontiers of technology, but also being very closely connected with the international network?
Yes, it must be so, that otherwise we have no other way out. First is very important to keep our technology independent from the outside influence. But actually, in practice, we have to say technology is not easy to be isolated or to be independent. Because as we know, technology should be connected with each other, developed with each other to support and also innovation. So innovation is not an independent idea. It's always connected with other technologies and linked with a bigger family together. So that's why we say technology has no border, has no political influence, but it should be connected with all frontiers, and especially for scientists. If we talk with the scientists in China or outside, that they say they cannot be isolated from the support from outside. But as a nation, we should try our best to get the best technology on ourselves. That means that the key interests and elements should be designed, manufactured, controlled by ourselves. So we can do it, and then we can provide our services with outside, with the international community, could be connected together.
Let's also talk about the distribution of wealth rather than the production of wealth, Mr. Liu. COVID-19 obviously has widened the gap between rich and poor, not here in China, but all over the world. So probably it's government's responsibility to decrease the income disparities. But that is a huge challenge because it is obvious in 2020 the income generated by wealth is much bigger than the income generated by manpower. How can the government address this?
I think this is really a headache for any government to consider the income gap, because everywhere you can see the similar questions, not only in China. But as a developing country, especially China has taken only 40 years of reform. The income gap is cannot be avoided to be enlarged or expanded at the first step. But nowadays we should consider how to narrow this gap, not to more expand it, because the income difference or income gap is basically that has its own development and principle, that we cannot by manual or manpower to narrow it or to expand it. But its principle is that who works harder, who has made great contribution, who have more income. This is a basic principle. But now there's something unfair, is that some people that they have some power or authority on the natural resources, then they can make full misuse or misconduct to make more money. This is the bigger problem. You know that we cannot always, as a so-called parity, that between all the people, the intellectuals and also the normal working people, that they have similar salaries or the wages. This is also not fair for the intelligence. So in this way, that we should discuss really in the diversifying the distribution of wealth, how to make in comparatively that parity in this wealth management. Otherwise, the bigger gap can be existing.
Steve, what are your thoughts about distribution of wealth? Should the market decide this? What is the government's role?
The market should not decide it, because What actually happens in the market is it transmits the power relations that exist in the underlying society. So if we look at the income distribution, the best explanation I've ever seen of the range of incomes both between countries and within companies is the hierarchy. The further you up a hierarchy, the more wealth you accumulate. And the only way that workers manage to get any income share themselves is not related on their marginal productivity, which is the standard economic theory, but on their capacity to organise and therefore compete, lobby for a part of the wealth which is created by society.
Then what can the government do to change the mechanism in a reasonable and fair way?
You really have to. In the 1950s and 60s in America and Europe, you could rely upon trade unions and bargaining power. That has been destroyed under neoliberalism, so unions are completely emasculated today. So the only real comeback, I think, is through the political process, which can enable workers to be given, or people who don't own capital rather, to be given a share of the income produced by that society through mechanisms like
what about
Social Security,
taxing the rich and physical policies?
The rich, I mean, you look at the island, the scene behind me, if you want to find where the rich put their money, they put it in the Cayman Islands and pretend that's where they made the money. They managed to evade national taxation systems. And we can see how dramatic this has been in amplifying the inequality that already exists. And frankly, central banks have made it worse through quantitative easing. So I'd rather say we have to use the state's power to create money rather than the state's power to tax, because the latter can be easily evaded. You can't evade the state's capacity to create money, and that could be a positive way to distribute wealth rather than the negative way of trying to do it through taxation.
And Mr. Liu, what is China's approach that is unique in the context?
China has tried its best to make a fair competition in industry and in all sections, but in fact that it's difficult to get its purpose, especially the parity of wealth distribution is not an easy job. So for the government role is limited, and I think the market mechanisms cannot also be fully enforced to manage all these problems. I mean that there should be a combination. That means the government policy and also the market mechanism, and the third factor must be emphasized is the law system. You know, last week I heard some news that in China, the Football Association launched a campaign that to have a ceiling limit of the salaries of the football player, for instance, to 10 million renminbi. So this is really administrative measures, whether it can be effective. So this should be discussed really.
I also want to talk about a new development in another front, that is the anti-monopoly supervision. China vowed to prevent disorderly capital expansion. Mr. Liu, how would you assess China's current supervision on monopoly and unfair competition, especially on those internet-based companies? Why is it necessary to strengthen supervision? What does it mean for them?
This is a very hot point at this moment in the past months, I think. Actually, in China, that anti-monopoly already existing over 20 years, and 20 years before we have outlined relevant laws against the monopoly. And we heard and we learned a lot of cases outside of the country that many international advancing countries also have similar questions. And we learned some experiences, and even we have some law system there. And China really has paid great attention to have the monopoly situation. But the situation is so complicated. So for two things, that state-owned company and the private company, who can be monopoly in the market?
They can
many
both
people
be.
Many people are discussing at the moment. So actually, before years, that many people try to discuss that some state-owned company, for instance, the energy companies and oil companies, they are controlling all the price market. So many people try to have so-called anti-monopoly, but we didn't go on. till the final situation. But at the moment, some internet companies, they have the advantages that they use the technologies and that they get the big data. They can supervise all the people.
So that's
information.
why it is controversial. Why should policies discriminate against private companies?
I mean that we still need a lot of time to make market research, to have a deep-sighted information how to go through this issue. This is not easy.
But another way to think of it is that those tech companies are innovating very fast. They are probably 1 or 2 steps ahead of the regulators. Steve, that's probably why the EU also has very tough legislation and proposals on digital services and markets. In the U.S., also lawmakers have condemned the big tech companies such as Facebook and Google for their monopoly power. Do they have similarities there? What is the role of the regulators in tech field?
It's very difficult because, as you and I would know, I mean, I'm a very major user of Twitter, and I'm not about to take on a second short messaging system. It would be a major loss in my personal welfare if I had to use 2 to reach my current message base. That gives us, actually, as consumers, a strong interest in having firms which do have a monopoly. So it therefore makes it necessary to regulate at the national level to have any control over their behaviour. And I have seen a very good argument by Dean Baker, for example, that Facebook should not have the protection that enables it to put up false advertisements right now, as it currently does, because if it didn't have that protection, then those ads wouldn't occur and it would be less powerful. So there are definitely reasons to regulate them sensibly.
We're running out of time. Before we let you go, I'd like to have your predictions on the Chinese economic performance in 2021. Some say that China will probably achieve 9% growth, bounce back from the low, slow pace. What do you think, Steve and Mr. Liu? Steve first, please.
I think it will bounce back, but I think the most important thing is to amplify what China is already doing, and that's making a massive transition towards green energy. Because the most important thing for the next 2 decades, without a doubt, is reducing the pressure we put on the planet. China is leading the way there, and it should continue to do so. Yeah.
And Mr. Liu, we have 2.5% growth probably this year. What about next year?
I think next year I'll be very optimistic, because I think based on the development in this year that we have already a good started for the next year. As we always say, 开门红, the first step is get ready to be further developed. So I mean, for figure of the GDP, I would not like to give you definite their figures. People say 6 to 8%. So 6 to 8%, but I believe 5% is more reasonable. And but the precondition is that all these 50 jobs that outlined in the conference or the Central Committee conference, well finished, well managed. I mean that this goal could be reached. But otherwise, if the challenger from outside, from the United States, they still try to boycott China from everything, and also the other international supply side will have more troubles with China. We will have more difficult times. So we should be ready for both sides. Yeah. One is that I'll try best to get good result, but get ready to be the worst result.
Yeah, probably being cautious is the wise way. Thank you very much, Mr. Liu, and thank you, Steve. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.